When my son married, I didn't mention I inherited my husband's ranch. Thank God I didn't. The morning Delia Marchetti showed up at my door with a man in a pressed suit carrying a leather briefcase. I was standing in my kitchen in Bozeman, Montana, pressing my thumb into a ball of pie dough the way my grandmother taught me 71 years ago. I heard the knock, and something deep in my chest tightened before I even opened the door. Not fear exactly. More like recognition. The way an old rancher reads the sky and knows a storm is coming hours before the clouds arrive. My daughter-in-law smiled at me from the porch, that particular smile she had, the one that never quite reached her eyes. "Eleanor, this is Gerald," she said, gesturing to the man beside her. "He's a notary. We thought we'd come help you sort through some of the paperwork around the property. Just to simplify things for you." I smiled back. I told them to come in. I offered coffee and pie. And I said nothing. Nothing about the 600 acres of timber and grazing land my late husband Frank had left entirely in my name. Nothing about the legal fortress my attorney had spent 3 months helping me quietly build around every single asset I owned. Nothing at all. But to tell you how I got to that moment standing calm in my own kitchen while the wolves settled onto my sofa, I have to take you back to the afternoon my son Carson told me he was getting married. It was late October, almost a year before all of this happened. I was outside splitting kindling behind the house, the kind of work that keeps a 70-year-old woman sharp and warm at the same time. Carson came around the side of the house with his hands in his jacket pockets and that particular look on his face he'd had since he was 6 years old, the look that meant he wanted something he wasn't sure I'd give him. He told me her name was Delia. 34 years old, worked in commercial real estate, drove a car that cost more than most people's first homes. He said she was extraordinary and that he needed me to understand her before the wedding, really understand her. And because Carson was the center of my world, the boy I had raised alone after Frank got sick, the young man I watched become someone decent and kind, I told him I was happy. I told him I couldn't wait to meet her. I spent 2 days preparing for that first dinner. I made Frank's mother's pot roast with the herbs I dry myself every fall. I baked sourdough bread from a starter I've been keeping alive for 19 years. I made a huckleberry pie from berries I'd picked and frozen the previous August. I ironed the linen tablecloth that only comes out for Christmas and Easter. I put on my good navy dress, the one with the small pearl buttons, and I did my hair the way Carol at the salon always tells me it looks best. I wanted Delia to feel welcomed into something real. Into a home that had history and warmth and love baked into the walls. When she walked through my front door, she looked around the room the way an appraiser does when they're already calculating what they'll recommend you tear out. She shook my hand instead of accepting my hug and said it was nice to meet me in a voice that suggested the opposite. Her heels were impractical for a ranch town in October, and her nails were the color of dried blood. She sat at my dinner table and picked at the pot roast as if the meat itself had personally offended her. Carson talked too much to fill the silences she created. He complimented everything twice. He laughed a little too loudly at nothing in particular. I recognized the behavior because I had done the same thing myself years ago, performing cheerfulness to cover the discomfort of people who didn't want to be warm. When I asked Delia about her work, she said it was complex and smiled without elaborating. When I asked about her family, she said they were spread out and left it at that. When I told her the sourdough starter was nearly 2 decades old, she nodded politely and didn't touch the bread. Before they left that night, she stood in my doorway looking back at the living room with those cool appraising eyes and said, "You've really held on to this place, haven't you, Eleanor? It must be so much upkeep for someone on their own." She said it gently, the way you might say something kind. But the message was already threaded through her words like a wire through insulation. The months that followed were a slow and methodical erosion. Each visit Delia made felt like a survey. She would ask careful questions about the house, about my finances, about whether I found it difficult managing everything alone. She called me once a week, always with that softness in her voice that had nothing tender underneath it. She mentioned, almost casually, that Carson worried about me, that they both thought I deserved more support. That people my age sometimes needed help recognizing when they were holding on to things they no longer needed. I listened, I said very little. I began paying much closer attention. At the wedding, held in March at a venue 3 hours from Bozeman, I wore the deep green dress I'd had made for Frank's retirement celebration a decade ago. I had my hair done the morning before and took the drive slowly, stopping once for coffee and once just to breathe. I was the groom's mother. I told myself that meant something. Delia had arranged the seating herself. I found my place card at a table near the back of the reception hall, between two of her colleagues from her agency in Denver, people who had never laid eyes on my son before that evening. Carson's closest friends, the men who had been groomsmen, were seated at the tables immediately surrounding the wedding party. I was not. When the toasts began, Delia's mother spoke for 4 minutes. Her maid of honor spoke for 6. 3 of her colleagues spoke. When someone in the room called out that the groom's mother should say something, Delia looked in my direction with an expression of choreographed warmth and said, "Of course, Eleanor can share something brief." Brief. I stood up. I had written 2 pages. I made it through 4 sentences before the clapping began, and I understood I was being silently sat back down. Carson danced with Delia. He danced with her mother and her 2 sisters. He danced with her friends. I sat with my hands folded on the table and watched my son move through a room full of people who had known him for less than 2 years, and I smiled because there was nothing else I could do with my face. I left before 11. In the parking lot, I heard Delia's voice carrying through the cold air as she laughed with her bridesmaids near the side entrance. "She's sweet," Delia said, "but you know how it is with these older women in small towns. Everything is a memory or a tradition. Carson will need some space to actually grow." The laughter that followed was brief and bright and completely indifferent to what it cost me to hear it. I drove home through the dark in a green dress that suddenly felt like a costume. The highway was empty, and the mountains were black shapes against a slightly less black sky. Somewhere around the halfway point, I let myself cry. Not for long. Frank always said I had the fastest tears in Gallatin County, in and out in under 2 minutes. He meant it as a compliment. By the time I pulled into my driveway, something had shifted. The crying was done, and something quieter and harder had taken its place. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and the stars overhead, and I thought about what my husband had said to me in the last weeks of his life. From the hospital bed, they'd moved into our bedroom so he could look out at the land he loved. "Eleanor," he'd said, "you are not a woman who needs permission to be formidable. Remember that. Whatever happens after me, remember that." I had put those words away in some drawer of myself and forgotten to open it. That night in the driveway, I finally did. The following morning, I made coffee, put on my boots, and walked out to the far barn where Frank used to keep his files in a cedar cabinet he built himself. I hadn't touched the cabinet in 2 years. I told myself it was grief that kept me away, but standing there in the pale morning light with the smell of cedar and old paper around me, I understood it was more than that. I had been afraid of what I'd find, afraid of the weight of it. What I found was a manila envelope with my name written on it in Frank's handwriting. Inside was the deed to 600 acres of mixed timber and grazing land in the Shields Valley, land his family had held for 3 generations, land that had passed entirely to me upon his death. There were appraisal documents from 5 years ago, before Frank got sick, valuing the property conservatively at several $1,000,000. There were cattle records, lease agreements with 2 neighboring ranches that generated regular income, and a letter Frank had written to me by hand that I will not share here, because some things belong only to the people they were written for. I stood in that barn for a long time. Then I walked back to the house, made a second cup of coffee, and began making phone calls. The first was to my oldest friend Patricia, who had known me since we were 23 and new mothers living on the same street in Livingston. Patricia answered on the second ring the way she always does, and when I told her everything, every detail from the wedding to the deed to the questions Delia had been weaving into our conversations like fishing line, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Eleanor Margaret Voss, you are going to see a lawyer tomorrow morning, and I am going to drive you there myself." The lawyer's name was Catherine Aldridge. She worked out of a modest office in Bozeman, behind a desk covered in organized files and flanked by 2 large windows that let in the kind of light that makes everything feel serious and clear. She had been practicing elder law for 28 years, and when I laid out the full picture for her, She nodded slowly in a way that told me she had seen this particular picture many times before. "What you're describing," she said, leaning forward with her hands clasped on the desk, "follows a pattern I recognize immediately. Isolation from the family network, repeated suggestions of incompetence or fragility, casual inquiries into asset value, manufactured urgency around financial decisions, and now a notary appearing at your home unannounced to help with paperwork." She paused. "Mrs. Voss, they do not know about the Shields Valley property." I told her they did not. I had not mentioned it to Carson, not to Delia, not to anyone outside that barn. "Good," she said simply. "Keep it that way for now." Catherine spent the next hour explaining what we would do. We established an irrevocable trust encompassing the ranch land, the house, and all financial instruments in my name. We documented every interaction I could recall from the previous months, dates, language used, the specific pattern of pressure applied. She gave me a small digital recorder and told me clearly that in Montana, single-party consent applied to recorded conversations. She told me to use it. I walked out of that office feeling something I had not felt since before Frank got sick. Not happiness exactly. Something more structural than that. Something that felt like the difference between standing on uncertain ground and standing on bedrock. I went home and I waited. The calls from Delia continued with increased frequency. She asked about the property taxes on the house. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that Carson worried the house was too remote for a woman my age to manage safely. She sent me an article about a lovely senior living community in Billings with beautiful mountain views and a full activities calendar. She said they were only thinking of my well-being. When Carson came by 2 weeks after the wedding, for the first time since, he sat on the couch in the living room where I had read to him every night for the first 12 years of his life, and he used a tone of voice I had never heard from him before. Patient. Rehearsed. Slightly elevated in the way people speak to the very young or the very old when they have decided you can no longer be trusted with your own decisions. He said they were worried. He said the house was a lot for one person. He said Delia knew people in property management and financial advising who could help me get more out of the assets I had and transition into something more manageable and appropriate for where I was in life. He did not quite meet my eyes while he said any of it. He played with his wedding ring the way he used to twist the buttons on his coat when he was small and anxious. I asked him if he was happy. The question surprised him enough that for a moment his face opened and he looked exactly like the boy he used to be. Then the moment closed and he said of course he was happy, and we should focus on what was best for me. After he left, I called Catherine. 3 days later, Delia called to say that she and Carson would like to come by Saturday to go over some helpful paperwork together. She mentioned that a notary named Gerald who worked with their financial advisor would accompany them. She said it in the same warm, practical voice she used for everything, as if we were scheduling a hair appointment. I said that would be fine. I said I had some pie in the freezer I could warm up. I hung up the phone and then I sat in Frank's old chair by the window and looked out at the mountains for a long time without moving. Then I called Catherine. Then I called Patricia. Then I went to bed early and slept better than I had in months. On Saturday morning, I got up before the sun. I made the real coffee, the kind Frank called serious coffee, and I sat on the porch in my wool coat watching the light come up over the eastern ridge the way it has every morning since Frank and I first moved here 34 years ago. The land looked the same as it always has. Ancient and patient and entirely indifferent to human scheming. I found that deeply comforting. I went inside and I dressed carefully, my good dark trousers, my grandmother's brooch, my boots that are worn but well-made. I looked in the bathroom mirror at the face of a 71-year-old woman who had survived grief and hard winters and the particular cruelty of being dismissed by people who should have known better, and I said out loud to my own reflection, "You are ready." They arrived at 1 in the afternoon. Delia in a cream-colored blazer with a leather tote bag over one shoulder, Carson with his hands in his pockets looking like a man walking into an appointment he wasn't sure about, and Gerald behind them carrying the briefcase I had been told about and wearing a smile that had professional warmth and nothing personal behind it at all. I welcomed them inside. I offered coffee. I set the warmed pie on the table. I sat in Frank's chair, and I listened while Delia began arranging her documents on the coffee table with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this before. She was gentle and thorough. She talked about simplifying my financial life. She talked about the house being isolated and the winters being hard, and how at my age, meaning 71, she said the words at my age the way someone might say it about a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness. It made more sense to consolidate and have professional support managing my money. Gerald smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals and produced forms from his briefcase with the quiet ceremony of someone performing a familiar ritual. The forms were specific: sale authorization for the house and property, transfer of liquid assets into a joint family trust with Carson and Delia listed as primary decision makers. A document that described me, in careful legal language, as someone who might benefit from financial guardianship given the complexities of managing an estate alone in later life. There was a line for my signature at the bottom of each page. Gerald had brought a gold pen. I looked at the forms for a long time. Long enough that Delia's composure developed a hairline crack, and she reached forward and pointed helpfully to the first signature line, as if perhaps I hadn't located it. "Eleanor," she said, and the warmth in her voice was so practiced it was almost impressive. "This is really the simplest and most responsible thing. We're going to take such good care of you." I looked up at my son. He was studying the pattern in the rug. He could not look at me. And in that moment I understood something that hurt more than any of the rest of it. Carson knew what this was. He was not confused or misled. He had made a choice and he was living inside it, and he could not look at his mother because somewhere underneath all of it, he was still the boy who knew the difference between right and wrong. "I would like to read each clause aloud," I said, "since I have a recording device running, and I want the documentation to be complete." The quality of silence that followed was extraordinary. Gerald's hand stopped moving. Delia's expression did something complicated that she rapidly corrected. Carson finally looked up. Before anyone could respond, there was a knock at the door. I rose slowly, unhurried, and opened it to find Patricia standing on my porch alongside Catherine Aldridge, and a man I recognized from a photograph Catherine had shown me, an investigator from the Montana Department of Justice's Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. "Hope we're not interrupting," Patricia said, and her voice was the warmth of 48 years of real friendship. "Right on time," I told her, and stepped back to let them in. Catherine introduced herself and her colleague with the particular calm of someone who has performed this specific rescue many times before. The investigator, whose name was Robert Crane, explained that he was there in an official capacity following a report filed by my attorney regarding indicators of potential elder financial exploitation. He produced identification. He had a camera for documentation purposes. He was courteous and professional and absolutely immovable. Gerald closed his briefcase. The movement was abrupt and poorly disguised and landed in the room like a confession. Delia attempted a recovery. She said there had clearly been a misunderstanding, that they were only trying to help, that family members looking after an elderly parent should not be criminally investigated for showing concern. She said the word elderly with a particular emphasis that under different circumstances might have stung. I let her finish. Then I went to the cedar cabinet I had brought inside from the barn 2 months earlier and placed on the shelf in my office, and I removed the manila envelope with my name on it in Frank's handwriting. I brought it to the coffee table, and I set it next to Delia's carefully arranged forms, and I opened it slowly. I read from the appraisal documents. I read the acreage. I read the current estimated market value, which Catherine's office had updated the previous week, and which had increased considerably from the figures in the 5-year-old documents. I read the lease income from the neighboring ranches. I read each line without rushing because I had waited 3 months for this particular moment, and I intended to take my time inside it. The room was absolutely still. 600 acres, I said, looking directly at Delia, and I own all of it, outright, in an irrevocable trust that was established and legally recorded 8 weeks ago. I paused. I didn't mention it because no one asked. Carson made a sound that wasn't a word. Delia stared at the documents the way someone stares at the moment, They understand they have fundamentally miscalculated. Gerald stood up and said something about needing to make a phone call, and Catherine stepped smoothly into his path and said that actually he should stay, as the investigator would need copies of all documents he had brought to the home, for the record. Gerald sat back down. Robert Crane began the formal documentation process. Catherine reviewed everything Delia had brought with the efficient thoroughness of someone building a case one brick at a time, which is precisely what she was doing. Patricia sat beside me on the arm of Frank's chair and put her hand over mine and didn't say anything because nothing needed to be said. At some point during all of this, Carson got up and walked out the front door. I heard his footsteps on the porch, then the crunch of gravel, then nothing. I did not follow him. I stayed in my chair in my own house on my own land, and I let the process complete itself around me. Gerald's license was reviewed by the state board in the months that followed, as part of a broader investigation that Catherine and Robert Crane's office pursued together. He was not the first notary to appear in stories like mine, and the investigation established he would not be the last. The network they uncovered had touched the lives of dozens of older adults across 3 counties. The recording from my living room was among the most significant pieces of evidence. Delia filed for divorce from Carson 4 months after that afternoon. Her attorney initially attempted to claim a share of assets Carson might theoretically inherit, but Catherine's trust structure had anticipated exactly that approach and rendered it moot. Delia left Bozeman without saying goodbye to anyone who would miss her. Carson called me 6 weeks after the divorce filing. He asked if he could come by. I said yes. He drove up on a Sunday morning and we sat on the porch in the October cold with coffee in our hands, and he talked for a long time. He said things that were difficult to say and difficult to hear and true, which is the only combination that actually matters. He did not ask for immediate forgiveness. He asked only if we could begin. I told him that beginning was available to him, that it would take time and evidence and patience, and that I loved him in the specific and permanent way that mothers love their children, which is to say without conditions and also without illusions. He nodded. He stayed for dinner. He helped me with the woodpile before he drove back to town. It was a start. Patricia moved into the smaller house on the ranch property the following spring. Not as a caretaker. As a neighbor and a friend and a partner in what had become, quietly and somewhat unexpectedly, a purpose. We had begun hosting small gatherings for women in situations similar to mine. Word spread the way word spreads in small communities, through phone calls and church bulletins, and the particular underground telegraph of women who have been told to be quiet and have decided not to be anymore. They came from Bozeman and Livingston, and sometimes from further. Women in their 60s and 70s and 80s who had been told they were too old to manage their own money, their own land, their own choices. Women whose children loved them and wanted control of them, and women whose children had married people who saw them only as financial obstacles to be rooted around. Women who had been patient and accommodating their entire lives and had arrived at a moment of clarity, the moment when you understand that being easy to dismiss is not the same as being easy to defeat. Catherine Aldridge came once a month to sit at the long table in my dining room and answer questions. She brought colleagues sometimes. Social workers, a state legislator who had become interested in elder financial protection after his own mother's experience, a woman from the Attorney General's office who was working on updated regulations. I spoke at a conference in Missoula in the spring. I spoke plainly and without drama about what had happened and what I had learned, which was this. The most dangerous thing a woman of my age can do is perform helplessness to make other people comfortable. The most powerful thing she can do is stay quiet about her resources until the moment it matters most to speak. Frank had been right about the strength. He had known it was there before I believed it myself. On the mornings when I walk out to the far barn before sunrise and stand in the cold air with the mountains going orange above me and the smell of cedar and hay around me, I talk to him a little. I tell him about the women who came that week and what they're dealing with and what we're doing about it. I tell him the land looks good. I tell him I remember what he said. Some mornings, I think about the woman I was the night of Carson's wedding, driving home alone through the dark in a green dress, swallowing everything down, telling myself that love required silence and accommodation and endless patience with people who offered very little in return. I think about her with something that isn't quite pity and isn't quite pride. Something that sits between them, the particular feeling of recognizing someone you used to be. At 71 years old, in a house my husband built on land his grandfather cleared, surrounded by mountains that have outlasted everyone I've ever known and will outlast everyone I'll ever meet, I have come to understand a thing that took me 7 decades to learn. Silence is sometimes the shrewdest strategy available, but it is only powerful when you are not silent because you are afraid. When you choose it deliberately, when you know exactly what you are protecting and why, when you hold it like a hand of cards and wait for the right moment to lay them down, then silence becomes something else entirely. It becomes the space between the lightning and the thunder. It becomes the held breath before the answer. It becomes, if you are patient and prepared and have the right allies beside you, the ground you stand on when everything finally, completely, comes to light. My name is Aliner Voss. I am 71 years old. I live on 600 acres in Montana, and I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. You are not too old to protect what is yours. You are not too old to recognize when something is wrong. You are not too old to say no clearly and mean it and have the structure behind you to make it stick. And if someone arrives at your door with a briefcase and a prepared smile, and the suggestion that all of this would be so much simpler if you would just sign here, remember that simplicity offered by someone who stands to benefit from your compliance is not simplicity at all. It is a transaction dressed up in kindness, and you are allowed to see it for what it is. The coffee is getting cold. The morning light is coming up over the eastern ridge. There is work to do today, good work, the kind that matters. And I have not once regretted the decision to stay quiet until the moment it was time to speak.